First of all, thank you to the organizing committee for letting me present here and to all of those who have come to attend this presentation. So today I've come to present you a comparative analysis between Bram Stoker's Dracula and the character of Judge Holden, the antagonist of Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian. You may know Cormac McCarthy probably due to other works such as The Road or No Country for Old Men. Here you can see the table of contents, the points that are about to be discussed. And before starting with the actual comparison, I believe that it is essential to make reference to this book. It is called Books Are Made Out of Books, a guide to Cormac McCarthy's literary influences. And there, Michael Crews traces all the literary influences that were relevant for McCarthy to create his work. And in fact, he devotes a whole section just to analyze all the literary influences that were relevant to create the character of Judge Holden. And I believe, so that you can understand what kind of antagonist or villain we're talking about, probably one of the most relentless, ferocious, brutal, and unforgiving characters, I think that it is crucial to mention some of these references so that you can have an overall image of what kind of villain we're referring to. The first one is Milton's Satan from Paradise Lost, and in fact there is this particular scene or moment where both Satan and Holden basically manage to achieve these gunpowder cannons to use to fight back, and the speech that they both provide are quite alike. In the case of Paradise Lost, as you may know, Satan manages to basically provide the rebel angels with these gunpowder cannons. And in Blood Meridian, the first time that the Glanton gang as such encounters Holden, they are basically running, escaping from Native Americans, and they have run out of ammunition. So basically what Holden does is that he basically picks different materials and manages to make this homemade gunpowder. Aside from that, Crews argues that, as such, Holden represents Nietzsche's Übermensch, this idea of the superhuman. Crews argues that this is so because due to his, let's say, divine powers or superhuman strength, but I believe that it actually goes beyond. It represents this idea of overcoming nihilism, overcoming the fact or that sense of alienation, that feeling of loss, of feeling that the earth has nothing to offer after the death of God. But as we've previously seen, what Holden does is basically that he manages to get from earth everything he needs to perpetuate war. And in fact, he argues that God is war. We have other references, such as the satanic figure from Young Goodman Brown that Brown encounters in the books. The description is quite alike in both cases. And aside from that, we have more satanic references, as you can see in the presentation, but there are two main points that I believe that are essential to understand Holden. The first one is Carl Jung's idea, the one that he expresses in his essay, Approaching the Unconscious, which is that life is a battleground, always has been and always will be. And if not, existence would come to an end. So basically, for the Judge, war is this ultimate game, and we are alive in order to bet our own lives in this game. Aside from that, the Judge also embodies this Faustian spirit. And this refers to the idea of having much knowledge, but being ceaselessly, continuously searching for more, in order to be able to impose his own will in the organic order. And as we will see, this has to do with the colonialist ideology and with white supremacy to some point. There are other references. We have Jacob Boehm's Satan, Herman Melville's Moby Dick, due to the physical appearance of both. But I find extremely relevant that in this book, there's not a single reference to Bram Stoker's Dracula. And for the reasons that I am about to provide, I do argue that, in fact, Dracula might have been used as a source of inspiration to characterize Holden. The first relevant point that we can see here is the use of Gothic. It is the main genre of Dracula, In the case of Blood Meridian, it is more difficult to somehow catalog what kind of genre we're referring to. It is this weird Western, as we've seen in the previous presentations, but it is also a historical fiction, and it has Gothic traces. To begin with, we can see the influence of this negative aesthetic. There is a constant interplay between light and darkness, this oppressing sun of the desert in comparison with this immense darkness. We also have in both novels this supernatural creature entering the mundane, the terrenal world, as it is the case in Dracula, we have this vampire, and in the case of Holden, as you'll see, even though he's represented as being human, he has definitely these divine powers, and it is some sort of demon. We can also see that both Dracula and Holden could be catalogued as satanic heroes, which Boting describes as those villains whose nefarious deeds seem to be more appealing to the reader compared to that rather bland hero. Aside from that, the influence of Romanticism is essential in both of the novels. We can see this prominence of nature, which basically acts as an extra character almost. The ideas of liberty, freedom, and escape are also rooted in both of the novels, in the same way that the Romantics try to escape from all that industry and have that sublime experience in nature. Jonathan Harker tries to escape from the castle of Dracula, and in the case of the kid, the protagonist of Blood Meridian, he does the same with Holden. And we also have that dichotomy between the psychological and the role of imagination. There are many events which we don't know if they're actually happening or it is just a product, a psychological product of the mind. And finally, both novels basically challenge societal norms by depicting vice, obsession, and perversion, and explore contemporary taboos as well. The first relevant point of analysis, this is the Tartalo Conference about the myth in the arts. So I believe that it is essential to talk about this dichotomy between myth and history, or myth and reality. Professor David Rio in Cormac McCarthy's Borderlands argues that McCarthy focuses on the interaction between history and myth in a continuous dialogical process of exchange and overlapping. And Gleason states that the Western has always had a particular and problematic relationship with history. It employs myth to interpret it and to disseminate it. We have seen how the hegemonic power, in this case the United States, have tended to use myth to hide all the historical violence upon which the United States was built, referring to Richard Slotkin's idea of regeneration through violence. But McCarthy does exactly the opposite. He basically deconstructs these different myths to end with this official version of a glorified and heroic conquest, in this case of Mexico, after the Mexican-American War. So that you can have an overall picture of Blood Meridian, what is it about? In general terms, we have the kid, the protagonist, who runs away from home. He escapes from the abuses of his father, and then he joins a band of filibusters, which are this renegade militia that aim to conquer even more territory of Mexico against the will of the United States government. And then he joins the Glanton gang that I have previously mentioned. These are a band of scalp hunters who are basically paid by the government of Mexico to murder Native Americans and then sell those scalps, which is the ultimate source of commodification and reification in this case. But we can see that what the Glanton gang does is basically that they decide that it's easier to murder innocent Mexican people and sell those scalps as if they were from Native Americans rather than be actually fighting with them. And let's say that the story starts getting darker when we realize that the Glanton gang did actually exist. And Blood Meridian is based on this book that you can see here in Samuel Chamberlain's My Confessions, Recollections of a Rogue. There, the author tells all that adventure that has many similarities, and it starts getting traumatizing when we realize that the character of Holden, that I am about to present, did actually exist. It has these historical foundations. In the case of Dracula, as you may know, there is also this historical basis. We have Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracul, Vlad Tepes, it has many names, but he was the prince of Wallachia, and it is this historical basis. And then we have these vampire stories. Yesterday, Jose Maria Merino told us about, well, the fact that vampires had already existed in ancient Roman civilization, but these two vampire stories definitely were relevant. As you may know, the Vampire was written and published by John William Polidori during that year without a summer at Villa Diodati, where Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, William Polidori, and Lord Byron were doing this ghost contest. And paradoxically, it was those who were less famous, in this case Mary Shelley and Polidori, who managed to publish these canonical works and works that even today are considered absolute masterpieces. And the other work that it is also relevant about vampires is Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, from this Irish writer. And here we have this dichotomy, because on the one hand, as Barnes states, Dracula effectively became part of the imperial discourse, both in its own portrayal of the exotic dangerosist and for its association with the vampire motif that recorded in colonialist texts. So on the one hand, it is true that it contributes to that exotification of the West towards the East, which was basically a way of justifying colonization, the need to go there and act there. But as Raúl Montero and Martin Simonson explain, Stoker also shows the effects of colonization and particularly of retaliation. And we must understand the influence of the Victorian Empire, who had conquered so many countries. And what Stoker is telling us is basically that those who have been oppressed might one day come, return, and avenge all that suffering. And this is why, in the beginning of Dracula, we have Jonathan Harker moving on to Romania, and then it is the vampire, it is Dracula, who comes to London, and it starts getting even more dangerous. If we analyze the physical descriptions of Judge Holden and Dracula, we can see that there are many similarities. To begin with, Holden is described as an enormous man, bald as a stone, no trace of beard, no brows, nor lashes, 7 feet in height, and his face was serene and strangely childlike. The fact that he has this childlike expression, I believe, that represents the hypocrisy of the United States, who basically aimed to hide, or, through the use of myth, all the atrocities that they committed and the fact that their country is built upon violence. And aside from that, Holden is also represented as being extremely pale. He's shown like the moon, so pale. So he's basically represented as this giant albino monster. This is why he has this similarity with Herman Melville's Moby Dick due to the physical appearance. And I argue that the fact that he's this enormous and white monster might represent this idea of white supremacy and colonial power. And in the case of Dracula, it is actually quite alike. He's also described as being as a tall old man, and as well, the general effect was one of extraordinary pallor. We can see that paleness becomes one of the main physical attributes of Dracula, and we have that dichotomy that I have previously mentioned of being representing that exotic East, which was somehow oppressed, and at the same time, he also represents this white supremacy. Moreover, last year, we had this presentation by Dr. Jasara, where she, from a biological perspective, talked about Gunther's disease, this extremely rare case of porphyria. And she basically explained how the symptoms of this disease resemble the physical attributes that are canonical of vampires. And I found that in the case of Holden, he also suffers from an extremely rare genetical condition, which is this alopecia areata universalis, as it refers in the Genetic and Rare Diseases Information Center. It is a condition characterized by the complete loss of hair on the scalp and body, and I believe that it might actually represent this idea of the adaptation or survival of the fittest, as in a world where they scalp each other, not having hair might, in fact, represent this genetical advantage. We can also see, as I've mentioned, that both characters represent this colonialist ideology. They both aim to be this master of masters and to basically dominate the world. In the case of Holden, we have references of him collecting different creatures, anonymous creatures, and he argues that only nature can enslave man, and only when the existence of each last entity is rooted out and made to stand naked before him will he be properly suzerain of the earth. This is basically his aim, to have this absolute control. In fact, he argues that whatever exists, he said, whatever in creation exists without my knowledge exists without my consent. So we can see this Faustian spirit that I have previously mentioned, this idea of having extreme knowledge but being continuously searching for more in order to be able to impose his own will. And I do believe that he represents or embodies these different apparatus that the hegemonic state has used in order to maintain their power. As Louis Althusser, the Marxist philosopher explains, on the one hand, we have this ideological state apparatus, which are those that aim to maintain hegemony through ideology, and Holden, he's a hand at manipulating everyone, and he also has this other tool, which are those repressive state apparatuses, those that have to do with violence, and we can see that he is willing to use it whenever he can. And it is exactly the same with Dracula. In fact, you can see here a quote so that you can imagine this idea of dominance. Your girls that you love are mine already, and through them you and others shall yet be mine, my creatures, to do my bidding and to be my jackals when I want to feed. So you can see that he basically sees humans as a source of cattle. This is as a way to feed himself up, but he aims to establish this absolute control as well. We can also see that both characters have this superhuman strength. In the case of Holden, we have many references of him showing this physical power. He's able to throw a large meteorite that a man was using as an anvil that cleared the mark by a foot. He's also able to murder this horse by crushing his skull with a giant rock, or he manages to lift a howitzer cannon that not even 4 members of the Glanton gang could lift. And he does it just by using one hand and lighting a cigarette on the other. And in the case of Dracula, as you can see, the quotes are from the beginning, but from the very first moment, Stoker clarifies the fact that Dracula has this superhuman strength. His strength was like a steel vise. Aside from that, both characters aim to master many different languages, and as we've seen, languages are a source of manipulation. It is a way to spread discourse, and that way to somehow spread ideology. Aside from that, languages are also a tool for mobility and to cross different thresholds, and this is actually what makes these villains extremely dangerous, the fact that they can move from a place to another. And yeah, in the case of Dracula, we have references of him speaking English and German, but being a nobleman from Romania, and due to the influence of the Hungarian Empire, he might as well speak Hungarian, Romanian, and Latin. And in the case of Holden, we have this example of him speaking Spanish, English, German, and Dutch. Está bien, said Holden. The judge spoke to him in German, and he speaks Dutch, said the ex-priest. Apart from the knowledge of languages, both characters also handle multiple disciplines, and they have this ability to adapt to whatever situation. In the case of Holden, among many other disciplines, he masters arts, sciences, archaeology, biology, chemistry, music, history, and in fact, the ex-priest Tobin, a member from the Glanton gang, mentions that the judge is a hand at anything. I've never seen him turn to a task, but he didn't prove clever at it. And in the case of Dracula as well, he also manages to learn whatever discipline he requires to achieve his purpose of dominating the world. He learned new social life, new environment of old ways, the politics, the law, the finance, the science, the habit of a new land and a new people. And finally, Boting mentions that those novels of horror are considered from a maze of alarmingly concrete imagery designed to induce fear, shock, revulsion, and disgust. And in this case, we can see that most of the violence is somehow sexualized. I've just put one example, but we have many implicit references of the judge murdering and raping different people, particularly minorities. And here you can see an example. We have at night the judge standing naked atop the walls, immense and pale in the revelations of lightning. He's basically reciting old poetry atop a roof under a thunderstorm. And there was this kid that was staying with them, with the Glanton gang. And next morning, that kid was lying face down naked in one of the cubicles, probably murdered and raped by Holden. And in the case of vampires, as Martin and Raul explained, we can see that idea of the fluids exchange that are clearly linked with this idea of sex. And in fact, the way how these violent acts are described, definitely, I believe that it is sexualized, as you can see in this example. The girl went on her knees and bent over me, simply gloating. As she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal. So for all the reasons that I have previously mentioned, I do believe that at least we should remain open the possibility that McCarthy might have actually got inspired by Dracula to characterize the Judge Holden. And this has been all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adrian, for your pretty nice presentation. We have now Claudia. She's online.
Hi.
Hello, Claudia.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.